Welcome to the debate. When you're sitting across from someone, maybe at a coffee shop, and you cross your arms a few seconds after they cross theirs.
Right, the classic mirror.
Exactly. Are you just, building empathy, or are you actually executing a calculated dark psychology tactic to manipulate their trust?
Well, if you ask me, you're just being a normal human being. But it is pretty wild how easily we can reframe completely unconscious, everyday behavior as something sinister.
So today we're diving into this concept of dark psychology in everyday life. We are looking at the strategic use of psychological principles to manipulate, to control, or really exploit others.
Yeah, and the central question we're tackling is this. Does the everyday, often unconscious use of psychological tactics, things like mirroring body language, or utilizing silence, or, guilt tripping, inherently cross into the unethical territory of dark psychology?
Right? Or are we just unfairly pathologizing completely natural, adaptive human social behaviors? I take the position that these mechanisms actually are fundamentally unethical and, dark. And the reason is that they bypass conscious consent. They exploit our cognitive biases and biological vulnerabilities completely regardless of the user's actual intent.
And I look at it from a completely different angle. While malicious, deliberate manipulation absolutely exists, categorizing everyday unconscious social behaviors as dark psychology is just a massive category error. It pathologizes normal human interaction, and honestly, it completely ignores the complexity of how we build social harmony.
Okay, so to set the baseline here, we really need to understand why there's such a hard line drawn around these specific behaviors. The defining feature of dark psychology isn't just the intent of the person using it. It's the mechanism of action.
Meaning how it actually works on the brain.
Right, exactly. When we look at standard neutral persuasion, like the classic principles of influence you'd see in basic sales or marketing, the target is generally aware that a transaction is happening.
Sure.
Dark psychology crosses a line because it actively distorts reality. It hijacks our fundamental wiring. We're talking about exploiting our deep-seated fear of rejection or cognitive vulnerabilities like the mere exposure effect.
Where our brains are tricked into liking something just because we see it frequently.
Exactly. The familiarity breeds affection bias.
But you're grouping incredibly disparate things together under one scary label.
Well, let me finish the thought, because the mechanism is what really matters here. Whether a clinically diagnosed narcissist uses these tactics consciously to dominate a partner, or, a well-meaning parent unconsciously relies on learned behaviors to guilt-trip their teenager, the mechanism remains identical.
Okay, but
the tactic bypasses the target's conscious awareness and their capacity for informed consent. Because it exploits the subconscious architecture of the brain, I argue it is inherently exploitative.
Look, I understand focusing on the mechanism, but I have to question the broad application of the dark label here. We are talking about universal human behaviors. If we group extreme, deliberate psychological abuse right alongside basic human conversational tools, the word dark just loses all its meaning.
I don't think it loses its meaning at all.
It absolutely does. Take gaslighting, for example. That term originates from a 1938 play where a husband deliberately and maliciously dims the gaslights to drive his wife insane.
Right. And telling her she's imagining it?
Exactly. All while telling her she's crazy. Placing that in the exact same behavioral taxonomy as mirroring is absurd. Mirroring is a subconscious evolutionary tool for building instant rapport. Human beings naturally, and I'd say necessarily, rely on these emotional negotiations.
They rely on manipulation?
No, they rely on connection. Without malicious intent to exploit another person, pausing in a conversation, or matching someone's tone, those are simply neutral tools of connection. We are social animals. These behaviors are the glue of social cohesion.
I hear you arguing for social cohesion, but let's actually look at how these tactics manifest in intimate daily relationships. Let's dig into guilt tripping, which is fundamentally a form of emotional blackmail.
Blackmail is a strong word.
But that's what it is. When a parent says to a child, after all the sacrifices I've made for you, or a friend says, I guess I don't matter to you anymore since you won't cancel your plans, they aren't just expressing disappointment.
They kind of are, though.
No, they are weaponizing the target's moral self-image. They are exploiting the biological norm of reciprocity, our hardwired instinct to repay debt. They're using the target's fear of being a bad person to force compliance.
But again, in most cases, the parent or the friend isn't consciously executing a psychological operation on you. They are just reacting emotionally. They're repeating learned behaviors that they probably picked up from their own parents.
And my point is that the lack of conscious malice doesn't change the impact. Think of it like a computer virus.
A virus?
Yeah, a virus harms a system regardless of whether it was deployed by a master hacker executing a targeted attack or accidentally forwarded by a well-meaning friend who didn't know what was hidden in the email attachment.
Okay, but
The friend didn't mean to hurt you, but the virus still corrupts your files. When you guilt trip someone, you're injecting a psychological virus that bypasses their logical decision-making and directly attacks their emotional vulnerabilities. The psychological impact on the victim is just as damaging.
yeah, I'm not convinced by the virus analogy at all.
Why not?
Because a computer virus is inherently designed to destroy. It literally has no other function. Human social behavior is designed to connect. Let's look at mirroring and the chameleon effect as the counterweight to your virus analogy. If you go on a date and the other person unconsciously crosses their arms a few seconds after you do, or they naturally start echoing your vocabulary, they aren't introducing malicious code into your system.
They are bypassing your rational assessment of them.
No, they are seeking connection through hardwired similarity bias. Biologically, our brains are wired to trust people who seem like us. It's an ancient survival mechanism. It's really better thought of as two tuning forks syncing to the same frequency.
But it's an unearned frequency.
Bypassing conscious suspicion isn't a bug in the software, it's a feature of human empathy. Treating the natural chameleon effect as a dark manipulation tactic just profoundly misunderstands human attachment. If we categorize the subconscious desire to build rapport as an unethical circumvention of consent, we are essentially saying that empathy itself is a dark art.
Well, genuine empathy is authentic. The dark psychology application of mirroring is inherently asymmetrical.
How so?
Salespeople, daters, influencers. They are trained to use mirroring constantly to create a false sense of deep connection. One person is operating authentically, relying on that tuning fork resonance you mentioned, while the other is deliberately adopting a persona to trigger a biological trust response. It's the asymmetry that makes it exploitative.
Sure, when a pickup artist does it intentionally, it's manipulative. I agree with that. But you're arguing that the everyday unconscious use is dark? That's where I draw the line.
Well, let's test that line by moving from intimate relationships into transactional interactions. Let's talk about workplaces and negotiations.
Okay.
Because this is where the boundary between normal persuasion and reality distortion gets incredibly blurry. Consider tactics like anchoring and paltering.
Paltering being telling the truth but deceiving by omission?
Exactly. Being entirely truthful but deliberately misleading. If you're listening to this on your commute right now, you might have paltered this morning. You told your boss, "I'm just finishing up that report," when you had actually just opened a blank document.
Right.
You're not technically lying, you are working on it, but you are deliberately distorting your boss's perception of reality to buy time.
Oh, come on. I think calling that distorting reality is a bit melodramatic. It's impression management. It's what people do.
But let's look at the mechanism. Let's look at anchoring in a salary negotiation. You drop an absurdly high number first. Why does that work?
To set the baseline.
Right. Because the human brain relies heavily on the first piece of information it receives as a cognitive anchor, and then it adjusts from there. But structurally, the brain almost always underadjusts. By throwing out an absurd number, you exploit that cognitive lag. You are deliberately circumventing their ability to rationally value the work.
I mean,
Or look at the foot in the door technique paired with the reciprocity norm.
you mean asking for a small favor before a big one?
Right. But again, the mechanism is what's fascinating. Let's say a coworker buys you a coffee on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, they ask you to cover their weekend shift.
Okay.
That's not just a friendly exchange. Our brains spend roughly 20% of our body's total energy, so they are constantly looking for ways to save calories. Once you make a small choice, like accepting a coffee, your brain locks in a consistency protocol to make future related choices automatic. you are now categorized internally as a person who cooperates with this coworker.
You're making a coffee sound like a trap.
The manipulator exploits that biological calorie-saving shortcut. It strips away the target's ability to evaluate the weekend shift request on its actual merits. It forces them to act in line with their prior minor action to avoid cognitive dissonance.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that anchoring a high salary or buying a coworker a coffee is dark psychology. We have to look at the context of the interaction.
Context doesn't change the cognitive bias being exploited.
It changes everything. Is anchoring truly distorting reality, or is it simply the universally understood language of negotiation? When you walk into a bazaar or corporate boardroom, there's a shared social contract. Everyone in the room knows that initial numbers are starting points, not factual declarations of cosmic value. To call that dark psychology is to pathologize basic commerce.
But not everyone is aware of the cognitive biases being used against them. That's the point.
But the intention is negotiation, not psychological destruction. And let's examine the power of silence, which is another everyday behavior often labeled as dark.
It is very effective.
The idea is that deliberately using silence after a statement forces the other person to fill the void, right? Often making them concede. So an employee asks for a raise and the boss just stays silent. The employee gets uncomfortable with the dead air and hastily lowers their ask. It's framed as an exploitation of our social conditioning to avoid awkwardness.
Which it is.
But consider the alternative. Is the boss utilizing a dark psychological tactic, or are they just exhibiting basic emotional regulation? They are literally just counting to 10. They are taking a breath to think before responding. We cannot equate a standard negotiation pause with something truly abusive like love bombing.
Interestingly, many frameworks do explicitly link love bombing to these exact mechanisms of control. Both rely on manipulating a target's emotional state to force a concession.
Hold on, I have to stop you there. Equating a silent pause to love bombing perfectly illustrates my issue with this massive broad umbrella. Let's unpack the actual mechanism of love bombing.
Sure.
It's not just buying someone too many flowers. It is a systematic hijacking of the brain's reward circuitry. It operates by flooding the victim with excessive affection, which spikes their dopamine and oxytocin levels. It creates an intense neurochemical high.
Right. A dependency.
Exactly. And then the manipulator follows it with a sudden, calculated withdrawal. This creates a catastrophic dopamine crash. The victim is left anxious, dependent, and desperately chasing the next hit of validation. It literally creates an addiction, often resulting in a trauma bond. That is profound, calculated psychological abuse.
I agree.
So equating the neurochemical trauma of love bombing with a boss taking a long, awkward pause before answering a question severely dilutes the meaning of true abuse. When everything is dark psychology, nothing is.
Look, I completely understand the concern about diluting the term, and I'm not saying a 10-second pause is equally as destructive as a trauma bond.
Well, it sounded like you were.
No, but I am saying the underlying mechanism linking them is the deliberate creation of psychological discomfort to force the other person to bend. Whether it's the severe manufactured anxiety of a withdrawn love bomber or the engineered social tension of a manufactured awkward silence, the tactic relies on the victim's intolerance for negative emotional states. The perpetrator knows the victim will sacrifice their own boundaries just to relieve the tension.
But tension is a normal part of life. If we can't tolerate 10 seconds of silence without feeling manipulated, the problem isn't the person pausing. The problem is our own lack of emotional resilience.
Which brings us perfectly to the practical application of this debate: how we should defend ourselves in our daily lives. This is where I find the dark psychology framework deeply empowering rather than paranoid.
Empowering?
Yes. By clearly defining these mechanisms, we can recognize when our cognitive blind spots are being exploited. The defense strategies focus on documenting patterns and building a baseline of self-esteem that is completely independent of others' validation. That's how you spot truly insidious, reality-distorting tactics like triangulation or DARVO.
DARVO being deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender.
Exactly. DARVO is an absolute masterclass in exploiting cognitive load. When someone confronts an abuser, the abuser immediately denies the event, attacks the credibility of the person confronting them, and then reverses the role so they are the victim.
Shifting the blame.
More than that, it suddenly forces the actual victim to defend themselves. It shifts the entire cognitive load of the argument, completely derailing the reality testing of the target. Or take triangulation, where a manager might falsely claim, "Oh, the rest of the team is really worried about your performance."
Using invisible others.
Right. They hijacked the consensus heuristic, our biological instinct to align with the safety of the herd, just to isolate and control you. By educating ourselves on the exact biological and psychological mechanisms at play, awareness turns victims into individuals who are in control of their own minds. These defense strategies are about maintaining the integrity of our own decision-making.
And I absolutely acknowledge the immense value of recognizing abuse. Being able to name Darvo or understand the mechanics of triangulation is a crucial, life-saving self-defense mechanism for anyone trapped into a toxic environment. If someone is breaking your grip on reality, you need to know how they are doing it.
Exactly.
But I have to raise a critical limitation about applying these defense mechanisms to everyday life. The standard advice in defending against dark psychology is that when in doubt, we should constantly ask ourselves, what is this person really trying to get from me?
Well, yeah, it's a prompt for critical thinking. It stops you from running on autopilot.
But applying that lens to every single human interaction replaces intellectual charity with constant, exhausting suspicion. It assumes a hidden, transactional motive behind every single behavior.
Not every behavior.
It often feels that way. Take the warning against we language. We're often told that someone saying, "We should do this," or "We're in this together," might just be creating a false alliance to manipulate you. If we view every conversational we, every shared pause, and every instance of body language mirroring through the lens of potential exploitation, we erode the very trust required to have healthy relationships.
You don't think a false alliance is a common manipulation tactic?
I think it happens, but I think genuine alliances happen far more often. If we adopt this hyper-vigilance, we isolate ourselves. We stop seeing a friend offering to buy us a coffee as an act of kindness, and instead, we neurologically brace ourselves for a foot-in-the-door reciprocity trap.
That's just being aware.
No, it's paranoia. We stop seeing a date's shared enthusiasm as a genuine connection, and we view it as the chameleon effect designed to bypass our suspicion. If you treat your mind like it's constantly under siege, you might keep the manipulators out, but you end up starving in the process. You survive, but you lose the ability to meaningfully connect with anyone because you've essentially criminalized the basic grammar of human affection.
I appreciate that caution. It is a very real risk, and I think it brings us to a crucial point of reflection as we sort of summarize our positions today. I maintain that human cognitive vulnerabilities like the fear of exclusion, the consistency bias, and the deeply ingrained norm of reciprocity are just incredibly easy to hijack.
They are.
Because our brains rely on these shortcuts to save energy and navigate the world, applying the dark psychology framework to everyday interactions is a necessary evolution of our ethical boundaries. Just because a behavior like guilt-tripping or paltering is common or even unconscious does not make it benign.
Right.
The psychological virus still corrupts the data whether it was sent with malice or by mistake. By understanding the specific mechanisms behind emotional blackmail and reality distortion, we can defend our personal autonomy against tactics that inherently bypass our conscious consent.
And I would summarize my position by saying that while awareness of severe intentional manipulation is unequivocally vital for self-protection, we must be incredibly careful with our definitions. Intent and context matter. Viewing the entirety of human social adaptation from standard negotiation tactics to subconscious report building through the cynical lens of exploitation strips the nuance from human behavior.
But does it?
It absolutely does. It turns every interaction into a power struggle. Empathy, mirroring, and the desire for social harmony are not inherently dark. They are the evolutionary tools that make society function in the first place.
Well, it seems we have found some clear points of convergence and divergence today. We both firmly agree that extreme intentional tactics, like the devastating dopamine hijacking of love bombing or the reality-distorting cognitive overload of Darvo and triangulation, are universally destructive.
Absolutely.
They require strong, defensive boundaries, and understanding how they work is critical for anyone's mental well-being. Where we remain in thoughtful disagreement is on the threshold of the dark psychology umbrella. We diverge on whether unconscious, everyday social behaviors inherently belong in this category because their underlying mechanisms bypass consent, or if the user's intent and the social context are the defining metrics that separate normal human interaction from psychological abuse.
Exactly. It really comes down to whether you view the mind as an isolated system that is constantly under threat from invisible psychological forces, or as a dynamic, deeply social system that is biologically meant to interlock with others, vulnerabilities, biases, and all.
Which brings us right back to where we started. When someone crosses their arms right after you do, the mechanism is the same whether they are a con artist or a friend. Today's examination leaves us with a profound tension to navigate. We have to choose, interaction by interaction, when to apply a critical lens to defend our autonomy, and when to apply a charitable lens to allow for genuine connection.
Yeah.
Understanding the mechanics of influence offers endless layers to unpack regarding our vulnerabilities. It leaves us with a fascinating challenge of observing our own conversational habits, the pauses we take, the guilt we might casually leverage, the mirroring we subconsciously perform.
The question is, are we protecting our boundaries or are we just afraid of human connection?
A question that certainly lingers. Thank you for joining us as we explored the intricate, sometimes murky waters of human influence. We leave you to observe the psychological forces at play in your own daily life and to draw your own conclusions.